Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The breaking point. Jake Malone stood on the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene before him. It was a hot summer afternoon, and the street was alive with the sounds of protest, chants, shouting, and the rhythmic pounding of feet on pavement. The usual tension in the air seemed heavier today. People were angry, their voices rising in unison against the system they felt had failed them. But as a police officer, Jake was no stranger to unrest. He had seen it all before: the heated arguments, the confrontations, the people who dared to challenge authority. But today felt different. There was something in the air, something that made his pulse quicken and his fingers itch for his pepper spray. Jake had been on the force for 15 years, and in that time, he had learned to view protests like these with skepticism. In his eyes, it was never about change, it was about chaos. Over the years, he had grown cynical, hardened by the endless cycle of angry crowds and volatile situations. But as he stood in the blistering sun, the crowd shifting like an ever-growing wave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this protest was different. Beside him, Officer Daniels shifted nervously, keeping his eyes locked on the crowd. "Jake, we need to be ready. This doesn't feel like it's gonna stay peaceful for long," Daniels muttered, his voice tinged with unease. Jake didn't respond at first, his gaze locked on the sea of protesters. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, something was telling him that today wouldn't be like the others. The chants grew louder, and the crowd pressed closer to the barricades, their faces filled with determination. Jake's jaw tightened, and he scanned the crowd more intently, looking for any sign of trouble. And then he saw him. Will Taylor. The name hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Will was a local teenager, known for his community involvement, his mentorship programs with younger kids, and his outspoken activism. But it was also known that Will had been tied to gang activity in the past, though nothing concrete had ever come to light. That was enough to raise Jake's suspicions. Will was in the middle of a group of younger teens, his hands moving animatedly as he spoke to them. His voice, though barely audible over the noise of the protest, carried a calm that seemed almost out of place in such a charged environment. Will's words echoed across the street. "Stay together. Stay peaceful. This is about making our voices heard, not causing trouble." Jake's eyes narrowed. There was something about the way Will was speaking, the way he was positioning himself, that made Jake uncomfortable. He had seen this before: the manipulation of idealistic kids by older, more dangerous figures. He was sure Will was using his so-called peacekeeping efforts as a cover for something darker. "Look at that," Jake muttered to Daniels, his voice low and filled with suspicion. "He's probably recruiting right under our noses." Daniels glanced over at Will, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure? He doesn't look like he's causing trouble." Jake's lips twisted into a tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You don't understand, Daniels. It's always the ones who seem the most innocent that are the most dangerous. He's just waiting for the right moment to escalate this. I've seen it before." As the protest raged on, the atmosphere became more volatile. The crowd was growing more restless, voices rising in anger as tempers flared. Jake's grip tightened around his baton, and he instinctively reached for his pepper spray, his finger resting on the trigger. He had dealt with enough protests to know that a single spark could set off an inferno. And then, it happened. A heated argument broke out between a group of protesters and the officers stationed at the barrier. Voices were raised, and the tension became palpable, like a storm on the verge of breaking. Jake's muscles tensed. He saw Will moving toward the commotion, his hands raised in an attempt to defuse the situation. But to Jake, it looked like a classic move, getting too close to the action, making himself the center of attention, drawing others in. "Hey, Taylor!" Jake called out, stepping forward, his voice sharp. "Back away from the line." Will turned to face him, his hands still raised in a peaceful gesture. "Officer, I'm trying to help keep things calm," he said, his voice steady but firm. Jake didn't buy it. His years of experience had taught him that people like Will, those who acted like peacekeepers, were often the ones who stirred up the most trouble. "Sure you are," Jake spat, his voice dripping with skepticism. "I've seen your type before. You think you can hide behind your peaceful act while you wait for the right moment to cause chaos. You're not fooling me." Will's eyes hardened, frustration clear on his face. "That's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to help." Jake didn't give him a chance to explain further. With a swift motion, he unclipped the pepper spray from his belt and, without warning, aimed it directly at Will's face. The spray hit him with a sharp, stinging burst. Will gasped and collapsed to the ground, his hands clutching at his face, his eyes streaming with pain. The crowd erupted into angry shouts, but Jake didn't flinch. He grabbed Will's arm roughly, pulling him away from the scene. "Next time, show some respect for authority," Jake growled, his voice cold and commanding. Will was struggling to breathe, his words barely audible as he gasped through the pain. "You don't know what you've just done." The crowd surged forward, trying to help Will as he stumbled away from Jake's grip. He collapsed into the arms of a few concerned bystanders, his body trembling, his voice hoarse. Jake stood there, watching them go, his chin lifted defiantly. He had done his job. He had kept the peace. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But as the minutes passed, something began to gnaw at Jake's conscience. The warning in Will's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't know what you've just done." The certainty that had come so easily to Jake began to waver, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake. But then he pushed the thought away. He was the law here. He had done nothing wrong. Later that night, as Jake cleaned his gear, his mind kept returning to Will's steady gaze, even as the teenager had been writhing in pain. There was something about that look that lingered in Jake's mind, something that unsettled him deeply. But he shook it off, reminding himself that he had made the right call. After all, he was the one who had the power to keep the peace. Wasn't he? As Jake turned off the lights in his apartment and sank into his chair with a beer, he tried to drown out the unease that still lingered. But as the evening wore on, his mind kept returning to Will. And the words that the teenager had said. "You don't know what you've just done." The weight of those words, though, was only just beginning to reveal its true meaning. The turning point. The next morning, Jake woke up with the familiar dull ache in his head, the result of a restless night. His dreams had been haunted by the events of the previous day, Will's pained face, the sharp sting of the pepper spray, and that warning, which seemed to echo louder with each passing minute. It was a strange feeling, one Jake couldn't quite place. He had dealt with confrontations before, many of them far more intense than what had happened with Will. Yet, this incident lingered in a way that unsettled him. He shook the thoughts off as he got dressed, preparing for another day on the force. There was no time to dwell on one mistake. After all, he was just doing his job. At the precinct, the usual hum of activity filled the air. Officers moved about, gathering their gear, going through their routines, and preparing for the day ahead. But Jake felt different, like something had shifted beneath the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play here, something he couldn't quite understand. Officer Daniels, his usual partner in these situations, greeted him with a nod as he entered the briefing room. There was a strange tension in the air today, and Jake couldn't quite place it. He sat down at their assigned table and glanced around. Everyone was talking in hushed voices, sharing news and updates, but no one was making eye contact with him. "Hey," Daniel said, lowering his voice. "You all right? You're a little off today." Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to mask his discomfort. "Just a lot on my mind. That protest, the kid. I don't know. Something doesn't feel right about it." Daniels raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, the briefing began. The captain stepped forward, his face grim as he addressed the officers. "Listen up, everyone. We've got a situation on our hands. You all saw the videos from yesterday's protest. Now the press is circling, and there's talk of an internal investigation. Jake's stomach dropped. He had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. His actions had caught the attention of the media, and now the higher-ups were taking notice. He had hoped it would blow over, that people would forget, but it seemed like the storm was only just beginning. "Malone," the captain continued, his eyes landing on Jake, "you've got a target on your back right now. Keep your head down and stay out of trouble. We'll be handling this internally, but don't think for a second that this isn't serious. It's bad for all of us, and I don't need to tell you how bad the optics are." Jake nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Will, about the way the teenager had looked at him after he sprayed him. It wasn't just pain in Will's eyes, it was defiance, a kind of quiet strength that shook Jake to his core. "Right," Jake muttered, trying to sound confident. "I'll keep that in mind." The rest of the briefing passed in a blur as Jake's mind continued to race. He had dealt with political pressure and internal investigations before, but this felt different. This was personal. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, as if things were spiraling out of control, and Jake was powerless to stop it. When the briefing ended, Jake gathered his gear and headed out into the field, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Will. What had the teenager meant by his warning? It had sounded like a threat, but there was a certain calmness to it, a sense that Will wasn't afraid of the consequences. Jake couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Will's story than he had realized. Across town, Will was still recovering from the events of the day before. His face was raw from the pepper spray, his eyes bloodshot and swollen. But despite the physical pain, it was the emotional toll that weighed heavily on him. He had never imagined that something like this would happen, not to him. He had been doing the right thing, trying to keep the peace in a situation that was already volatile. But it hadn't mattered. The officer, Jake, had decided that Will was a threat before he even gave him a chance to explain himself. As Will lay in his bed, his father, Judge Dan Taylor, entered the room, his face grim with concern. Dan had seen his fair share of injustice in his career, but this was different. This was his son. And no matter how many cases he had presided over, nothing could prepare him for the sight of Will in pain, suffering not only physically but emotionally as well. "How are you feeling, son?" Dan asked, his voice soft but filled with a quiet intensity. Will looked up at his father, his expression tired but resolute. "I'm fine, Dad. Just sore." "It's nothing." Dan sat down beside him, his eyes searching Will's face for signs of deeper wounds. "Tell me what happened," he said gently. "I need to know exactly what went down." Will hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he sat up in bed. He didn't want to burden his father, didn't want to bring his world of politics and justice into this personal moment. But his father's presence was grounding, and Will knew there was no avoiding it. He needed to tell him the truth. "I was trying to help, Dad," Will began, his voice shaky. "The protest was getting out of control. People were angry, and I was trying to keep things calm. I wasn't causing trouble, I was trying to do the right thing. But that officer..." Will's voice faltered as the memory of Jake's actions hit him again, a fresh wave of pain flooding through him. "He pepper sprayed me, Dad. For no reason." Dan's face hardened at his son's words, but he said nothing. He simply placed a hand on Will's shoulder, offering silent support. He knew the system, knew the game all too well. This was a battle he couldn't ignore. It was bigger than just Will, it was about justice, accountability, and the way society viewed those who tried to stand up for what was right. The doorbell rang, interrupting the silence. Dan rose to answer it, his face tight with determination. It was Marcus, one of the kids Will had been mentoring. The young boy's face was filled with worry, and he stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation. "We saw the videos, Will," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "Everyone's talking about it. You're not alone, you know. We've got your back." Will nodded, a small but grateful smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Marcus. I need to stay strong, not just for myself, but for all of us. I can't let this slide." Dan stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "We'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves," he said, his voice firm. "But we need to be smart about it. This isn't just about Will. It's about what this means for everyone else." Will looked up at his father, the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't just a personal injustice, it was a reflection of something much larger. And now, he realized, they had no choice but to fight back. Meanwhile, across town, Jake sat at his desk, nervously scrolling through social media. The videos from the protest were everywhere, circulating on news outlets, social media platforms, and even local blogs. Each time he saw the footage of Will in pain, his gut twisted. He had acted in the heat of the moment, but now the consequences were clear. Will wasn't just another protester. He was the son of a powerful judge, and the ramifications of his actions were beginning to hit home. Jake had never been one to back down from a fight, but this was different. This was about more than just an isolated incident. This was about public perception, about accountability, and about the very system he had sworn to uphold. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. An internal investigation was launched, and every move Jake made was under scrutiny. He couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. And the more he thought about Will, the more he realized that this wasn't just about one teenager. It was about everything he had believed in, and everything that was slowly beginning to unravel. Jake had thought he was in control, but now, he wasn't so sure. A fractured system. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air as the days passed. Jake couldn't remember the last time he had felt this trapped, this unsure of his place. The internal investigation was progressing, and it wasn't just the higher-ups who were watching him, his fellow officers were too. Whispers behind his back, the sideways glances, the hushed conversations. He could feel their judgment, whether they voiced it or not. The precinct had always been his world, the one place where Jake felt grounded. His role as a law enforcement officer had defined him for nearly 2 decades. He had seen it all, the protests, the riots, the unrest, but he had never been a part of the story in the way he was now. His actions had sparked something that he couldn't undo, and every time he walked into the precinct, he was reminded of that fact. As Jake sat at his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him, his phone buzzed. It was an unmarked number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Jake Malone?" The voice on the other end was gruff, unfamiliar, but the tone immediately set his nerves on edge. "Who is this?" Jake asked, trying to steady his breath. "You don't know me, but I know you. And I know what you did." The voice was low, a cold edge lacing every word. "You messed with the wrong kid, Malone. You'll regret this." The line went dead before Jake could even respond. His heart hammered in his chest, his pulse racing. This wasn't just an anonymous threat, it felt personal, like someone was watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the creeping sense of paranoia that had settled over him. He had made mistakes before, everyone had, but this one felt different. He couldn't explain it, but the idea that he had wronged Will Taylor in some way that was now spiraling out of control gnawed at him. Across town, Will was also wrestling with his own sense of unease. He had always been a fighter, both figuratively and literally, but this time was different. The physical pain of the pepper spray had faded, but the emotional toll was something he couldn't shake. The injustice of it all had left him reeling, and now, it felt like everything around him was crumbling. His father, Judge Dan Taylor, was doing everything in his power to ensure that the incident wouldn't go unnoticed. Dan had reached out to several influential figures, both within the law enforcement community and outside of it. He was pulling every string he could to make sure this incident didn't get swept under the rug, but Will could sense his father's growing frustration. "Son, this isn't just about you anymore," Dan had said to him the night before. "This is about accountability. It's about the system that we both serve. But you have to understand something, it's not going to be easy." Will had nodded, but inside, his thoughts were far from calm. His father was a man of principle, a man who believed in the law and the sanctity of justice, but Will had begun to question everything. The system was broken, and he was starting to see just how deep the cracks ran. Dan had promised Will that he would fight for him, but Will knew the reality was far grimmer. There were forces at play that even his father couldn't control. The Taylor family was respected in the community, but even that respect couldn't shield them from the harsh realities of power, corruption, and politics. It was mid-afternoon when the news hit. Another viral video had emerged. This one showed the moment Jake had pepper-sprayed Will, but it was more than just a clip of an officer using excessive force. It was an unfiltered look at the chaos that had erupted, and the public reaction was swift. Outrage spread like wildfire across social media, with people demanding accountability for the officer's actions. Hashtags like #JusticeForWill and #EndPoliceBrutality began trending, and it wasn't long before the story made its way into every major news outlet. The media frenzy was in full swing, and the pressure on Jake grew unbearable. Every time he opened his phone, he was bombarded with messages from people he didn't know, asking him why he had done what he did, why he had hurt an innocent teenager who was only trying to help. It felt like the world was turning against him, and for the first time in his career, Jake didn't know how to handle it. His interactions with his colleagues had also shifted. Officers who had once supported him now kept their distance, offering only curt nods or brief exchanges. They could sense the shift in the department's atmosphere, and most of them weren't eager to get caught up in the storm that was unfolding. Officer Daniels had tried to talk to him, but even his closest partner had begun to back off. "I don't know, Jake," Daniels had said one evening as they worked the streets together. "I'm just not sure how much longer we can keep defending this." Jake had tried to shrug it off, but the words lingered. He wasn't used to doubting himself, but as the days wore on, he couldn't escape the sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. The more he tried to push the thoughts aside, the louder they became. The images of Will's pain, the defiance in his eyes as he begged for mercy, it all haunted him. Back at home, Jake spent sleepless nights scouring social media for any hint of what might be coming next. It was like being stalked by a shadow, with every post, every comment, every video, pushing him further into a corner. He tried to remind himself that he was in the right. He had acted in the heat of the moment, but it had been necessary. Hadn't it? But the more he thought about it, the more doubt crept in. Maybe Will hadn't deserved it. Maybe the teenager had been doing what he could to stop the violence and protect the younger kids in the crowd. Maybe the system was bigger than he had realized, and his actions had been a part of something far more insidious than he'd been willing to admit. And then, one evening, Jake's world collided with Will's again. The phone rang. It was another blocked number, and this time, Jake knew it wasn't a threat. "Jake, it's Will," the voice on the other end said, his tone unexpectedly calm. Jake's heart raced. He had braced himself for anger, for accusations, but Will sounded collected, almost like he had been preparing for this moment. "Will," Jake said, his voice faltering slightly. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." "I know," Will interrupted, his voice firm but not hostile. "But you need to understand something. This isn't just about me. It's about everything we've been taught, everything we've believed. You can't keep hiding behind the badge, Jake. You have to see what's really happening." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Jake felt the weight of Will's words sinking into him, cutting through the layers of defense he had built over the years. For the first time, Jake saw it. Will was right. The system wasn't as simple as he had once thought. It was fractured, filled with cracks, and the more he tried to ignore them, the more they seemed to widen. The call ended with Will's last words lingering in the air like a challenge. "I'm not asking for you to fix everything. I'm just asking for you to see it. Really see it." Jake sat there in the dark, staring at his phone, unable to shake the feeling that everything had changed. For both of them. The road to redemption. The following days felt like a blur for both Jake and Will. As the media frenzy intensified, and the pressure mounted, they were both forced to confront a harsh reality that neither of them had ever truly understood until now. Their worlds, so different on the surface, were connected by a thread of injustice that neither could ignore. Will had always known that his activism and leadership in the community would put him at odds with the system at times. But he had never expected to become a symbol of everything that was wrong with that system, especially in such a personal, painful way. After his conversation with Jake, something inside him shifted. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't even sure he was looking for justice, at least not in the way others defined it. What he wanted now was accountability and change. Will spent the next few days reflecting, doing what he did best, mentoring. Kids from the neighborhood came to his home, worried about the fallout from the incident. He had always been a source of guidance and inspiration for them, but now, his very identity had become a symbol of resistance. They came not just for his words, but for reassurance, a sense of stability in the chaos. But deep inside, Will was struggling. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel strong. He felt tired of fighting a battle that seemed endless, tired of seeing the same faces, the same pain, over and over again. His father's unwavering belief in the system was something Will had once shared, but now, in the wake of his own experience, it felt like a dream that was fading. That night, as he sat in his room, he picked up his phone and texted Jake. It wasn't something he had planned. The conversation had lingered in his mind ever since they'd spoken, the weight of Jake's guilt and confusion hanging between them. Will hadn't expected an apology, not really. But there was something about the way Jake had spoken that made him think that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than they both understood. Jake, we need to talk again. But this time, without the badges, without the cameras. We need to be real. You ready for that? Jake's response came minutes later, a simple text that said, I am. The meeting was set for the next evening. Neither Jake nor Will knew what to expect. They had both come from different worlds, seen different truths, yet somehow, they were drawn together by a single moment in time that had changed them both forever. Will arrived first, standing outside a small coffee shop on the corner of the street where the protest had taken place. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. Jake pulled up in his car, parking a little further down the street. His heart was pounding in his chest. He hadn't seen Will since that day, but everything had changed. Even the air felt different. It was as though the world had shifted its axis, and they were now standing at the center of something larger than either of them could comprehend. Will's gaze met Jake's as he walked toward him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stood there, neither knowing how to begin. It was Jake who broke the silence, his voice quiet, tinged with uncertainty. I've been thinking about what you said, Jake began, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. I don't know what I expected that day. I didn't mean to hurt you, Will. But I did. And I can't just brush that off anymore. I've been looking into you, into your family. Into what this is really all about. Will's eyes narrowed, but not out of anger. It was more out of surprise. He had expected some form of denial or justification. But Jake wasn't defending his actions. He was admitting that he had been wrong, and that was the first step. I didn't know who you were, Jake continued, not really. I thought you were just another troublemaker, another kid caught up in the wrong crowd. But when I saw your dad, when I saw who he was, what he stands for, I realized that I was wrong. I've been wrong about so many things. Will didn't know what to say. It wasn't often that people, especially someone like Jake, would admit they were wrong. But there was sincerity in Jake's voice, a quiet desperation that made Will pause. I've spent my whole life thinking that people like you, officers, cops, they were just part of the system, Will said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. I never thought you were capable of seeing the other side. But here we are. Both of us stuck in this mess, because of the same broken system. Jake swallowed hard, the weight of Will's words sinking deep into his chest. It was true. The system was broken, and he had been a part of that. He had believed that doing his job was enough, that following orders was all that mattered. But now he saw how it had all become a machine, grinding up those it was supposed to protect. "I've never been a part of something like this," Jake said, his voice shaking. "I didn't know how much pain we were causing until I saw it in your eyes. And now I can't unsee it. I don't know where to go from here. I don't know what to do." Will looked at him, his expression softening. "You're not alone, Jake. It's not too late to do something. You have the power to change things. You just have to decide if you're going to keep following the same old path, or if you're going to step off it." There was a long pause before Jake spoke again. "What do you want from me? What can I do?" "I don't want your pity, Jake," Will said firmly. "I want you to use your voice. Use the power you have. This isn't just about one cop or one kid. This is about a system that's built on fear and injustice. You've seen it, too. Now, we have to make sure it changes." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of Will's words settling in. "I don't know how yet," he said quietly. "But I'll start by doing the right thing. No more hiding. No more ignoring the truth." The next few weeks were filled with unexpected turns. Jake's involvement in the protest incident had sparked something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. The media scrutiny intensified, but so did the calls for justice. The investigation into Jake's actions moved forward, and he was placed on administrative leave as a result. But it wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the entire system. Will, for his part, continued his work in the community, but now he had an ally in the most unexpected of places. Jake, though still uncertain of the exact path forward, began to use his voice. He started speaking out about the systemic issues within law enforcement, advocating for change in a way he never had before. His experience with Will had opened his eyes to the fact that true justice wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about making sure those laws served the people. Together, they worked towards something greater than either of them had ever imagined. They knew the road would be long, and the challenges were far from over. But in each other, they found a shared purpose, a commitment to creating a world where no one was treated like a criminal simply because of the color of their skin, or the badge they wore. As they walked down this uncertain path, both Jake and Will understood one thing: change would only come when people were brave enough to confront their own biases, their own fears, and their own complicity. They had crossed paths in a way neither could have predicted, and now, it was their duty to make sure that crossing led to something better, for themselves, for the community, and for the future. It was just the beginning of a journey neither would ever forget, a journey that would forever alter the course of their lives.